Tell me what it was like clerking for Justice Stevens. I don't know what that exactly means, clerking, but
Yeah.
correct me if I'm wrong, but he was known for defending civil rights and civil liberties and kind of known as a common sense justice on the high court. What was that time like, and what do you think was the most profound thing that you learned from observing him and working with him?
Well, Justice Stevens is an amazing human, an amazing lawyer, and an amazing human. Uh, Clerking, I also, I got to law school not knowing what a clerkship was. In fact, when I I don't really have lawyers in my immediate family, and but clerkships are they're very competitive jobs. So each judge, this is true in the federal system, it's true in the state, it's different in the state courts, but in the federal courts, each judge, depending on the level of court you're talking about, gets 2 or 3, or at the Supreme Court, 4 law clerks. It's a 1-year position. They tend to be young lawyers, pretty fresh out of law school, who help them do legal research, help them with drafting opinions and orders. And so you really have a bird's eye kind of inside view of the judicial system at a really young age, at an early stage in your career. It's a great privilege, and an amazing education, kind of a continuation of law school in some ways. And I had the great fortune to work for 2 brilliant judges. Guido Calabresi, who I clerked for on the Court of Appeals, is a former dean of the Yale Law School and a really influential tort scholar, one of the fathers of law and economics. And then I clerked for John Paul Stevens, who, as you say, was very different because not an academic, very common sense judge, came out of law practice in Chicago, and was a lower court judge before he became Supreme Court justice, and just an incredibly humble, brilliant person. I think the smartest man I've ever met. He has like just a brilliant legal mind, a photographic memory. The story I love to tell is sitting in chambers with him talking about cases. And, I clerked for him in 2000. He'd been on the Supreme Court at that point for 25 years. And, 5 years before that on the Court of Appeals. And he would remember cases he had worked on decades before, would remember the arguments, the conference discussion among the justices, who voted which way and who changed their vote. And then he would just go up to, we had a wall of all the books that had the opinions in them, the Supreme Court reporter. And he could just, there are hundreds of volumes, and he would just go and pick the volume off the shelf that had the case he wanted to find and open it up, that was just the man he was, but it really known to be incredibly focused on fairness, very interested in context and in the facts of cases. And really, I think of him as a judge in the common law mold, which to me is the best kind of judge. A judge who believes in narrow decisions, in incrementalism, and in grounding his decisions in lived context.
Yeah. It seems to me that the current Supreme Court has gotten a lot more political than some people are comfortable with. I'd love your opinion briefly on what's going on currently today in terms of the Supreme Court.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Supreme Court has always been a political body. It operates on its own cadence, right? But justices are appointed by the president, confirmed by the Senate, so they're going to be influenced by the politics of the time that they're put on the court, and the court shifts over time in response to longer trends of political change. And it's always deciding cases that are hard, contentious, that have been the source of disagreement in the lower courts. So there's a kind of unavoidably political dimension to the work of the Supreme Court. And yet justices can be more or less ideological in their approach to the act of judging. Justice Stevens is on one end in really being grounded in the law as he understood it. He had commitments clearly, and those influence his decision-making at the margins, but really took seriously precedent, took seriously the coherence of the law across different areas, and took seriously his own limitations, as a judge deciding a case at one point in time. And so avoided sweeping ideological decision making.
Hmm.
And so, I think when people say the courts become more political, I think what they mean really is it's become more ideological, so that the behavior of judges becomes a little more predictable based on what we think their priors are.
Hmm.
And it's certainly become more conservative. I mean, every year that Justice Stevens was on the court, whenever a justice retired, they were replaced, with one exception, by a justice who was more conservative than they were. And the exception being probably Ruth Bader Ginsburg for Byron White.
Hmm.
But even that, maybe there was some shift to the right on certain issues. So the court as a whole really shifted over the course of his career. He was appointed by Gerald Ford, and so that over the period of his career from Gerald Ford to Barack Obama, when he retired, the court shifted quite dramatically to the right.
Yeah. As I mentioned, you're the first non-Jesuit president of Seattle University in 133 years. I had the honor of knowing your predecessor, Father Steve Sundborg, through our membership in the Rotary Club of Seattle. I was so impressed always with his leadership and just him as a person. I'd love to know why the university looked outside the Jesuit community for its new leader, because it was a big shift for Seattle U, and I'd love your perspective on that.
I think when Father Steve was hired, he said, "I'll be the last Jesuit president of Seattle University." And I think, the reason for saying that at the time was that he could see that there were fewer and fewer Jesuits who were really focused on higher education. So the numbers of Jesuits overall is shrinking, as with other Catholic priests. And then the focus of the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, over time has shifted. So earlier in the 20th century, there was a really strong focus on higher education and secondary education. And then in the 60s, really right after the Second Vatican Council, the society shifted its focus towards more direct work with poor and people on the margins, and that attracted people to the Society of Jesus who were less interested in higher education and higher education administration. And so it's a combination of fewer Jesuits and fewer Jesuits who are really interested in university leadership. But we have this beautiful and rich community of Jesuit universities, 27 Jesuit colleges and universities around the United States. And so there's been a very deliberate process of transitioning those universities to lay leadership. I would say 10 years ago, out of those 27, it might have been that 3 or 4 of them had a lay president. I think one of the first was Georgetown under Jack DeGioia. And now, I believe of the 27, there are 4 Jesuits who are presidents. So it's completely reversed. And I'm sort of in the middle of that. I came in kind of in the middle of that transition. But every president who's been hired during my time, my 3 years now at Seattle U, every president of another Jesuit university has been a lay person, and many of them replacing Jesuits who are retiring. So Father Steve he was president for 24 years at Seattle University, kind of preparing the university for a transition to non-Jesuit leadership. And so the university had a lot of time to kind of come to terms with that and get ready for that.